Whatever level of commitment Canada might have had to peacekeeping in the past, and as problematic as that peacekeeping was, and we saw in the case of Somalia what peacekeeping really meant, as problematic, however, as peacekeeping was, that era has clearly come to an end. Even the kind of token gesture towards peacekeeping has now come to an end in Canada with the war on terror. With its active support for the US-led war, Canada has become a stronger partner of US imperialism and an active supporter of US attempts to dominate the global economy, a domination which is dependent on the ability of the United States to gain control of and to gain access over the vast resources of the Middle East and Central Asia. Canada has not only been willing to transform its commitment to peacekeeping into a commitment now to war-making, Canada is also now a key partner in the North American Anglo occupation of Afghanistan. The impact of this war, therefore, is going to have long-term consequences both at the global level and for us here in Canada. When addressing the impact of the war, I think the first thing that all of us have to recognize, and the first priority for our organizing, is to look at the violence that has been wreaked on Afghanistan and on Iraq. Hundreds of thousands, if not over 1 million Iraqi and Afghan deaths have resulted from this war. Large numbers of communities have been displaced, huge refugee flows. The humanitarian disaster is really going to have a huge impact not only in those countries, but all around the world. The airstrikes and the aerial bombings of the United States in Afghanistan and Iraq have also had a horrendous impact on civilians, on the infrastructure, on the environment in both countries. We don't know what the long-term effects of all of this is going to be. This is a particularly brutal way to fight wars. It targets civilians while protecting soldiers. Regardless of what political and army elites claim, it is a form of collective punishment on a population. And we have to speak out against this. The acceptance by large sectors of the mainstream population in the United States and Canada in fighting wars in this way is a scandal. And it has been dismaying to see how little attention is paid to this particular aspect of the war. The second impact of the war I want to focus on is that it has once again legitimized the view that the lives of Americans, Canadians, the British, and other Europeans are worth much more than the lives of Iraqis, Afghans, and other Muslims. This dehumanization of Muslims will also be of lasting consequence. A remaking of the North-South divide, of the East-West divide, this time in the name of the clash of civilizations and the clash of cultures, is again redividing the world. In North America, the stripping away of the rights and entitlements of Muslims has been predicated on a profound hatred of Islam, the Islamophobia that is now regularly voiced in the media, that has found newfound sanction, racial profiling which has now found public sanction, are transforming our societies in a very deep way that are going to have, again, very long-lasting impacts on our society. What we are seeing is a rewriting of racialized divisions into the very structure of this society. The idea that Muslims pose a threat to the national security of Canada, of the US, of the UK has become pervasive now, and sometimes it is often, unfortunately, even accepted in our movements. So the racism that is the result of this kind of dehumanization and targeting of Muslims is something that we have to stand up against, and that has been one of the impacts of this war. The third major impact, I think, is the displacing of the idea that the rule of law should be paramount, both inside countries and at the international level. With regards to the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the Afghan war continues to be popularly defined and accepted as just and necessary, whereas the Iraq war, many of us now are increasingly accepting as clearly illegal and unnecessary. The idea that one war is just and necessary, which President-elect Obama has completely bought into, and that the other one is unjust and unnecessary is something that we have to challenge. Both wars are illegal. Both wars are unjust. The Afghans were, of course, not responsible for 9/11, as even the Bush administration had to accept. And we have to keep remembering that after the attacks of 9/11, the Taliban actually offered to negotiate with the United States, turning over bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, as many as they could find, in Afghanistan to a third Muslim country if the U.S. produced evidence that they had been responsible for the attack. We cannot forget. There has been such a demonization of the Taliban that people forget, even in our movements, that there was a serious offer to resolve the conflict in a different way, which was rejected outhand by the United States, and there was no pressure from Canada, the UK, or any of the other partners of the United States in this war to look for a different way to resolve the conflict. The US ignored any other way except violence and war, and Canada and UK went right ahead with supporting this approach. The Afghan war is also seen as legal because the United Nations supposedly passed a resolution of sorts to legitimize the war. On the Iraq question, of course, the UN did not pass a resolution, but even the resolution that is used to justify the war in Afghanistan is defined by many legal scholars as illegal and not a justification for war. Among the United Nations resolutions that were passed on terrorism after 9/11, legal scholar Michael Mandel, for just one, for example, notes that neither of these resolutions mention the use of military force. The United Nations Charter allows war only when it is absolutely and demonstrably necessary, Mandel argues, and even then, necessity is entirely a matter for the Security Council, with only one exception, the strictly limited right of self-defense. And of course, the United States claimed this right of self-defense in launching the war in Afghanistan. But as Michael Mandel explains, this right of self-defense enshrined in the UN Charter that the United States claimed depends on 4 factors. One, it is a temporary right until the UN can intervene, and the state attacked in the case that carried out the initial attack, there is an element of necessity, but that the attack, supposedly for the purpose of self-defense, has to be proportionate in response. It has to be proportionate in relation to the initial attack. This, of course, has not been the case in Afghanistan. By these criteria, Mandel concludes that the US war in Afghanistan is illegal and violates the UN Charter. So we have to keep remembering this, we have to keep stressing this, and we have to keep calling for an end to the war in Afghanistan, especially now with President-elect Barack Obama making this transition in the United States. It's very, very important for the anti-war movement around the world to keep pushing Obama to not go for a strategy of a surge in Afghanistan, but a complete pullout of Afghanistan and negotiation, a negotiated settlement. So what has been the impact of the war on women and on gender relations in the West and at the global level? Too often we're content with pointing out how women are victims of the war and are suffering the most brutal and brutalizing effects of the war. This is certainly true for women who live in the war zone. The millions of Afghan and Iraqi women caught in the bombardments and in the mass dislocations of populations in both countries are certainly carrying a disproportionate level of the burden of this war and experiencing disproportionate levels of violence. Most feminists here in Canada and the US have also pointed out how women and children are amongst the most vulnerable victims and are arguing that the Bush administration has hijacked feminism to mobilize popular support for the war. Certainly it is true that the Bush administration and the Canadian government also hijacked feminism, but feminists also, we have to recognize, many in the US and Canada did defend the war. They argued that this was necessary in order to liberate Muslim women. In fact, there were feminist organizations like the Feminist Majority in the US who actually called for the Bush administration to intervene in Afghanistan to save Afghan women from the Taliban and from Afghan men. So feminism's position on the war has not been a pure one, it's not been a clean one, and it's not something that we will be proud of in the coming decades. The level of participation of women in this war is historically unprecedented. And for us to focus on women as just victims of the war is to lose sight of the fact that many women are actively engaged in fighting this war, both in the Canadian Armed Forces, in the American Armed Forces, in the British forces. Many women who are part of the political elite in the United States have been staunch defenders of the war. Condoleezza Rice, for example, Hillary Clinton, Janice Karpinski, who was the general in charge of Abu Ghraib prison, Dana Perino, who's been the spokesperson for the Bush administration for this last little while. All of these women are outspoken defenders of the war. And we do ourselves a disservice if we don't recognize that women are actively benefiting from their participation in this war. Some women are. In the US and in Canada, they are building professional careers, they're moving up the political ladder, joining the political elite by the support and the legitimation that they have given to this war on terror. So we have to recognize that women are divided on the question of the war, and we cannot fall back on a lazy analysis of presenting women as only victims and vulnerable in this war. Certainly, even the women who are fighting the war are vulnerable in a way that men soldiers are not. There have been cases of rape of American women who are serving in the American Armed Forces in Iraq. Women soldiers have committed quote-unquote suicide, but as the US Army is claiming, but many journalists are reporting that these women have been raped by their male colleagues, by independent contractors, and have even been murdered. So certainly some of the women who are also actively waging this war are experiencing the violence that is a very factor of this war. But that cannot be used to put us into this lazy position of arguing that women are only suffering. The women's movement in this country and the women's movement in the US has never been an anti-imperialist feminist movement. It's never been an anti-colonialist feminist movement. And while many of us have struggled to transform these women's movements into anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist movements, we still have a long way to go. And to present the idea that women are only victims and suffering in this war makes the job harder of transforming feminist movements and feminist organizations into anti-imperialist feminist movement. So, what should we do? So, what are we to do? What are some of the main challenges that we face? I think there is much that activists need to organize around today, and I want to propose a few issues that I think are very key for us to organize around. One it is clear that war crimes have been committed in this war. General Taguba's report on the Abu Ghraib prisons, the testimony of the winter soldiers that was given in the United States, some of the interviews that some of the returning soldiers are giving demonstrate very clearly that war crimes have been committed. We have to build international pressure on President-elect Obama to immediately launch an investigation and a process to start the prosecution of those Americans who have committed war crimes in Iraq and in Afghanistan. In Canada, we also need an investigation to look at the role of the Canadian Army in Afghanistan. If war crimes have been committed, they too need to be investigated and persecuted. There is a myth in Canada that is also pervasive amongst our social movements, that the war is really an American war and that Canadians are just doing good there. But we need to challenge this myth. And we have to look at what the Canadian soldiers have been doing in working with the US military in Afghanistan. And again, for us in Canada, if war crimes have been committed by Canadian soldiers, we have to press for investigation and prosecution in this country as well. The second thing I think we need to do in Canada is to mobilize a strong movement against the Harper government's participation in the war on terror. Absolutely no participation of Canada in the war on terror, and this means rescinding agreements with the US, ending the anti-terrorism measures that have been implemented, ending the anti-immigrant policies that have been adopted by the Canadian government in the name of fighting this war on terror. This has to be a key priority for us in Canada. The third priority, of course, has to be in standing up to the racism that has made all Muslims potential targets of state repression wherever we live, whatever citizenship we claim right to. We have now all become vulnerable to US agencies because of the willing cooperation of the Canadian government and the British government with the US in this war. So no to racial profiling, no to targeting the Muslim community, and no to demonizing Islam and constituting Muslims in the Canadian national imaginary as a threat to national security. And the fourth priority I believe that we need to focus our attention on is to call for an end to torture in all its forms, wherever it is perpetrated. One of the worst effects of the war on terror has been to normalize and justify the use of torture. And the media has helped tremendously in normalizing and legitimizing the use of torture in the name of protecting national security. Activists have to fight this routinization, institutionalization of torture that the war is seeking to accomplish. We have to build pressure on President-elect Obama to close Guantanamo Bay, to close Abu Ghraib, and to close all the secret US prisons that have been built around the world. This has to be a key priority for us. Certainly, Obama has voiced his opposition to torture. He's been very clear on this question. But taking swift action to investigate and prosecute war crimes will be the clearest statement that he can make of his opposition to torture being a solid, committed opposition that will actually mean something in global politics today. For far too long, Americans have lived by the rule that they are above the law, they are above international law. The biggest change that Obama can make is to hold Americans accountable both to US law and to international law. And we have to mobilize. We have to mobilize a strong international movement to put that pressure on Obama. Thank you very much.